So I was a costume designer for almost 20 years. I worked on Broadway musicals and Shakespeare and opera and downtown experimental dance theater. And um, I always was frustrated by the fact that when I was doing research, there were so many books for women's dress and so few books on the history of menswear. And so when I started thinking about writing, I thought, well, I should just want to fill the hole and contribute to providing something that costume designers would benefit for. That was how I first started thinking about this project. And then I was doing research for a production of La Traviata, which is an opera where it starts act one as a fancy dress ball. So the question was like, what should the male chorus be wearing? And really, like in opera, the answers are like either white tie or black tie. You know, you've got tails or tuxedos, essentially. But they were setting this production in the 1850s, and I started thinking, like, was white tie like an actual uniform in the 1850s, or did that not happen until later? And like flipping back through my database of images to the 18th century, and I was like, wait a minute, nobody was wearing black and white in the 18th century. They were wearing like pink velvet and floral patterned waistcoats and coats with gold embroidery all over them. But then by the middle of the 19th century, men were all wearing black and white for evening dress. And I thought that was so strange. And it's especially noticeable in places where there's formal wear, where men are all wearing the same uniform and women are all wearing something totally different. And so I just was fascinated by how different that was, these like unofficial dress codes were, and what a big impact it probably had on the way that men and women exist in the world as dressed beings. So that was basically the origins of where this question came from. And so all in all, like maybe 12 years. It was a long time, but it included me going back to graduate school. I was trained and worked professionally as an artist, as I said, for almost 25 years before going back to graduate school. First, I got a master's degree, and then I got another master's degree, and then I got a PhD. And so I was in my PhD program for 7 years. So this book started off as my dissertation for my PhD program. And then after I finished the PhD program, it took about 3 years to revise it into the stage of the book. I would say the biggest shift during the research process was I was doing archival research right when the pandemic hit. And so all the archives were closed. And that was really disappointing to me because, I had spent a lot of time in fashion archives. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to come back and get a PhD that wasn't in a fashion studies program, to get into the real history archives and see just like what other questions that you can ask when there's different kinds of source material. So I was just like really needing primary sources to look at, but I was forced to go online and look for things that were digitized. And at the time, the project was really specifically focused on formal wear, which has a very particular origin story and a kind of short gestation period between around 1810 to around 1850. So it was a really like narrow time period that I was looking at. And I thought, well, it's too early. And does anyone really care about Thomas Jefferson still? But boy, those founding fathers online or archives sure are digitized and keyword searchable. So I thought to myself, well, I'll spend like 2 hours tomorrow afternoon and that should be good. And then of course that like completely changed the whole project. In the first 20 minutes, I found this whole series of letters that George Washington had written to his tailor who was in London, who he never even met in person, complaining about how his pants never fit. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is the kind of story about men and their clothes that I've been looking for years. And so many books have been written about George Washington, but that's a sort of thing that rarely comes up, that like nobody has heard of. So I thought, well, gosh, this like has to be in the book. It's such an important part of the story in terms of the relationship between men and their clothes. So I ended up broadening the time period of the project so that it would incorporate the founding fathers and the American Revolution. So now it spans between the American Revolution and roughly the Civil War. And it's not just about formal wear, it's about more uniformity and sartorial conformity and suits more broadly. So in terms of books that inspired the ideas in this project, I would say this one has kind of a funny origin story. In the 1930s, there was a psychologist in England named J.C. Flugel, and he was a really interesting character. He had a lot of anxiety about his own clothing. He was a part of the like Men's Dress Reform Association, and he was really worried in the 1930s about the effect that the drabness of modern suits had on the masculine psyche. So he wrote a lot about fashion and its effect on gender. And in fact, he coined this idea. He called it the Great Masculine Renunciation, where he traced it back to the French Revolution. And so he said, like, after the French Revolution, man gave up like decoration and adornment and his wardrobe and adopted this plain and uniform costume. And he called it like the most important shift in the history of dress, which you could say it's true, at least in the history of men's dress in the Western world. So basically, that's pretty much what I'm looking at. And I build on his idea and I talk about how this actually had an even bigger impact on broader ideas about gender and adornment. It wasn't just about the change in men's fashion, but the fact that the change in men's fashion had ripple effects on culture across the world. And I'm telling it from the American story. So instead of drawing it back to the French Revolution, I sort of dial it back a little bit earlier to the American Revolution. I don't know that I feel like I'm the person that people should come to for advice, because I really came into this project kind of through the back door, you know, being trained as an artist. My initial medium thinking about clothing was through actual clothing. I was, you know, shopping and building things and drawing things and commissioning things to be built and then dressing them on people. I actually started off as a theatrical dresser working backstage, where I was literally like lacing people into corsets and tying on their cod pieces and their capes and doing their laundry. And it's funny, I hadn't thought about that work in a long time, but it was really impactful on the questions that I had coming into this project. And one of the things that I found really challenging about being in an academic space was that people were always asking me what my argument was. And I was like, I don't know yet. That's not the way that I see the world. And it might be the way that a lot of academics see the world, but I just really, you know, artists ask a lot of questions. I think artists are very curious people and want to get to the bottom of things. And so this might be more for academic writers, but I would say don't worry so much about the arguments and really just follow the questions and feel confident that questions can lead you in really interesting places and without having to rush to an argument too quickly.